She had already been married 4 times before. To most people, that fact alone might have raised questions. But to those who knew her, she was simply a woman who believed in love, again and again. Each relationship, she claimed, had failed for reasons beyond her control. Then came the 5th husband. Friends described the relationship as intense, fast-moving, and almost too perfect. Publicly, it looked like she had finally found stability. Someone willing to trust her past and believe in a future together. But that future would never come. Late one night, authorities were called to what was initially reported as a medical emergency. By the time first responders arrived, it was clear that this was not an accident. The 5th husband was dead. The scene was unsettling. There were no obvious signs of a break-in. No signs of a struggle that made immediate sense. And the woman who called for help appeared calm, almost detached. As if she had already accepted the outcome. Investigators knew one thing right away: this case would not be simple. As detectives began asking basic questions, small details didn't quite line up. Timelines shifted. Answers felt rehearsed. And emotions didn't match the gravity of the moment. Then someone mentioned her past. 4 previous marriages. 4 previous endings. And now, a 5th husband dead. What initially looked like a tragic coincidence began to feel like something far more deliberate. Investigators realized they weren't just dealing with a single crime scene, they were standing at the end of a long and dangerous pattern. Because when police started digging into the woman's history, they uncovered similarities that were impossible to ignore. Relationships that escalated quickly. Conflicts that stayed hidden from the outside world. And endings that always left her standing alone. By the end of that first night, detectives understood something chilling. This wasn't a crime driven by sudden rage. It wasn't a momentary loss of control. It was the final chapter of a story that had been repeating itself for years. And the deeper they looked, the darker it became. Lucy had always been a private person, someone who kept her personal life close to her chest. She was polite, soft-spoken, and careful about the people she allowed into her world. Friends and acquaintances often said they didn't know her as well as they thought they did. Her charm was subtle, but it carried a quiet intensity that drew people in without them realizing how deeply connected they were becoming. Her past relationships were never simple. Each marriage ended for reasons that, on the surface, seemed ordinary: disagreements, distance, incompatibility. Yet there was a pattern that went unnoticed by most: each relationship escalated quickly, and each ending left a trail of disruption behind her. She carried herself as someone who believed in love, even if it didn't last, and she expected the same from those who chose to be with her. By the time she met her 5th husband, Lucy's life had become a careful balance. She was independent, financially stable, and emotionally guarded. She did not rush into relationships lightly, yet this 5th connection seemed to follow the familiar pattern: a whirlwind romance, intense attention, and a sense of inevitability that everything would be perfect. Her friends described the couple as happy, even devoted, at first glance. But as authorities would later discover, appearances can be deceiving. Behind closed doors, there were subtle tensions, signs of control, and small disagreements that hinted at a deeper imbalance. What the public saw as a perfect romance was, in reality, a fragile situation teetering on the edge of disaster. Lucy's life, already marked by repeated patterns, was now poised for its most devastating chapter. As investigators would come to realize, the same traits that made her compelling also made her vulnerable. She had allowed someone close into her life, someone who would ultimately exploit trust in a way that no one could have predicted. It was this combination of charm, secrecy, and past experience that set the stage for the tragedy that would follow on that fateful night. And it was a stage carefully hidden from everyone outside her home. The night had begun like any other, with a quiet promise of intimacy and calm. The couple had planned a private evening, a chance to reconnect and leave behind the outside world. From the outside, it seemed like a romantic rendezvous, candlelight, soft music, laughter echoing lightly through the rooms. But what unfolded that night would shatter everything. Around midnight, neighbors reported hearing unusual sounds, a thud, a brief argument, then silence. It wasn't until later that emergency services were called. When the first responders arrived, the scene was chilling. The fifth husband lay lifeless, his body in a position that suggested neither struggle nor accident. The room was undisturbed, no signs of forced entry, no evidence of intrusion. Everything looked almost too controlled. Lucy, who had called for help, remained eerily composed. Her voice had been steady, calm, almost rehearsed. She described the discovery matter-of-factly, giving exact details that seemed rehearsed, almost like she had anticipated this moment. Detectives immediately sensed the incongruity. Her demeanor did not match the gravity of the situation. There was no panic, no shock, only a quiet precision that unsettled everyone present. As the investigation unfolded, conflicting statements began to emerge. Friends who had spoken to her earlier in the evening described nothing unusual, yet the timeline told a different story. Minor inconsistencies piled up, a missing glass, an unaccounted-for phone call, subtle behavioral slips. Each small detail hinted at something far more sinister than a random tragedy. By the time detectives started reviewing the night, a darker truth began to surface. This was not a simple accident, nor was it a crime of opportunity. Every observation pointed to careful planning, to a scene orchestrated with deliberate intent. And then, as investigators dug deeper into her history, the pattern became undeniable. Lucy's past was no accident. Each relationship, each marriage, had quietly followed the same trajectory: intense beginnings, subtle conflicts, and ultimately, devastating ends. The romantic rendezvous that was meant to be a fresh start had instead become a crime scene, and it was just the beginning of a story far darker than anyone could imagine. When detectives began examining Lucy's past, what they uncovered was far more unsettling than anyone could have anticipated. They weren't just investigating a single death anymore. They were investigating 5 marriages, and the circumstances surrounding each one were eerily similar. Her previous husbands, like the fifth, had all seemed to fall for the same charm, a combination of warmth, attention, and a seeming devotion that drew them in completely. Friends and family often described the relationships as intense, passionate, and fast-moving. Yet, behind closed doors, small tensions and conflicts had always existed, the kind that outsiders rarely noticed. Financial entanglements became a recurring thread. In each marriage, Lucy had benefited from shared assets, insurance policies, or sudden inheritances. The timing of certain events raised eyebrows, disagreements escalating into separations, disputes over money coinciding with unexpected financial gain. It was as if each relationship followed an invisible blueprint, leading inevitably to a tragic conclusion. Investigators began to map out the pattern in chilling detail. The first husband had died under mysterious circumstances that were originally ruled accidental. The second and third marriages ended with financial disputes and sudden moves, leaving Lucy in possession of shared assets. Her fourth husband had survived longer but also faced unexplained accidents and sudden losses. And now, the fifth husband was dead, a mirror of the past, a man who trusted too much and learned too late. Friends who had once described Lucy as caring and devoted began to rethink everything they knew. Was it possible that the same woman who seemed so gentle and charming could have orchestrated such a series of events? And if so, how had she avoided suspicion for so long? The deeper detectives looked, the more patterns emerged, details that were subtle yet undeniable. Each relationship started with intensity, followed by small conflicts, and ended with financial or personal loss for her partner. There was always control, always a careful calculation of timing, always a veneer of innocence that masked a darker reality. Finally, one detail stood out, the detail that would unravel the carefully constructed story Lucy had told investigators. It wasn't a single piece of evidence, it was the repetition itself, the unmistakable pattern of destruction that could not be ignored. The detectives realized they weren't just piecing together a crime, they were uncovering a lifetime of manipulation, of charm used as a weapon, of love turned into a trap. By the end of the investigation, it became clear, Lucy's story was not one of coincidence. It was a meticulously repeated pattern, and the fifth husband had become the latest chapter in a series that had been decades in the making. By the time the truth came to light, it was already too late for the fifth husband. Lucy had been arrested, her calm demeanor never faltering, her explanation rehearsed but unconvincing. The evidence was overwhelming: financial records, timelines, witness statements, and the unmistakable pattern linking her past relationships. The prosecutors painted a chilling portrait: a woman who had captivated and controlled, who had allowed trust to flourish only to let it wither into tragedy. The trial was grueling. Each previous marriage was examined in detail, every small inconsistency scrutinized under the harsh light of the courtroom. Friends and family were called to testify, forced to reconcile the charming woman they knew with the disturbing image emerging on the stand. Every narrative piece added weight to the prosecution's argument: this was no isolated event. 5 men, 5 marriages, and now a 5th death. All connected by patterns of manipulation, subtle coercion, and ultimately, a deadly outcome. Throughout the proceedings, Lucy maintained a composed exterior. Her attorneys argued for innocence, for coincidence, for the absence of direct evidence linking her to premeditation. But the jury could not ignore the facts: the patterns were too precise, the similarities too numerous, the motives, financial, emotional, and psychological, too consistent. When the verdict was finally delivered, it carried the full weight of consequence. Guilty on multiple counts, the sentence reflected the severity of a lifetime of deception and the culmination of a pattern that had ended in death. Outside the courtroom, the public reaction was a mixture of shock, fascination, and disbelief. How could someone so seemingly ordinary be at the center of such extraordinary tragedy? In the aftermath, the fifth husband's family struggled with grief, betrayal, and the haunting question of what they had missed. Friends of Lucy wrestled with their own disbelief: the woman they thought they knew had been living a life far darker than anyone could imagine. Love did not kill him. Trust did. And as investigators reflected on the case, one chilling truth remained: patterns, once established, rarely break without leaving destruction in their wake. The fifth husband was the final, tragic chapter in a story that had been quietly repeating itself for years, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous threats are hidden behind the mask of devotion.